Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session 5, the final session of the AMBA and BGA Festival of Excellence. And for the next 90 minutes, we're going to have a very insightful conversation to discuss making an impact, corporate social responsibility. I'll shortly hand over to Andrew Main-Wilson, CEO of AMBA and BGA, to moderate and chair the conversation. But before I do, I just want to remind you all that if you have any questions at all for the panel, please feel free to pop them into your Q&A box just at the bottom of your Zoom panel. Or indeed, if you have any comments, just pop them in the chat box and we will pick them up and add them into the conversation. I think that's all from me. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, David, and thank you all very much for joining us. We hope to have a really natural, lively hour and a half. So as David said, please do put your questions forward. And what I will do is I will save them to the end, but we're going to leave plenty of time at the end for your questions. So please do put those forward. Just before I start and introduce our guests and ask them to give a little bit of detail about their careers, I just wanted to share one slide from our latest climate research, which shows very clearly the size of the problem that we're facing. David, I wonder if you could share the slide. And it's this, we asked 500 business school leaders and over 2,000 students and graduates, MBA students and graduates, how they describe the current condition of our planet environmentally. And you can see that the problem is acknowledged. Only 19% of students felt the planet was in any way in a good state. And that reduces, perhaps with experience and age, with business school leaders, where only 14% were positive. And you can see that the negative score was basically 2/3 across all three categories. So it kind of neatly encapsulates the problem. And of course, we're not just talking about the environment today, we're talking about broader corporate social responsibility. But I just wanted to set that little scene first. Okay, thank you, David. So now I'd like to introduce all three of our speakers, starting with James Gom, the Director of Sustainable Development Goals at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. James, if you could kindly share in 1 or 2 minutes your background and experience.
Sure, thanks Andrew. Hello everybody. So my name's James and I am the Director of Sustainable Development Goals at the WBCSD. It's one of those organizations whose acronyms actually harder to say than the organization itself, but we are the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And we are a collection of 200 multinationals who join this business membership organization with a view to advancing business solutions to key sustainable development challenges. So for all of the issues that companies are struggling to handle by themselves or tackle individually, the World Business Council brings those companies together in a pre-competitive space to discuss solutions, discuss ways of scaling new innovations, discuss ways of engaging positively on the positive front, to create some on the policy front, to create a more enabling sustainable policy environment, and to generally to advance the cause of sustainable development through collaboration, which is our reason for being, with the view that we need to make sustainable business more successful in the long run. And I've been at the WBCSD for around 5 years. And before that, I worked for Mitsubishi Corporation, who are a large Japanese conglomerate. And I worked in sustainability and public relations for them for around a decade, during that time as well, doing my own MBA. So I'm very familiar with the challenges of completing the MBA, but also tying MBA topics into the sustainability landscape as well, which can be challenging, but is also essential. So really looking forward to the discussions today.
Thank you, James. And now I'd like to introduce Celia Willett, who is the CEO for Responsible Business Initiative for Justice, and obviously is a social justice expert. Celia, over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Thanks, AMBA and BGA, for inviting me. Yes, I am the founder and the CEO of RBIJ, where the acronym is easier than saying it all out, James. We're a non-profit organization, kind of founded very much at the ground level to work with businesses to champion change across systems of justice. Our mission is we really believe that businesses are part of the solution when it comes to injustice, and that businesses are increasingly being called to take steps to both be part of the solution and talk about being part of the solution, be visibly part of the solution on injustice. But that for businesses to kind of take the right action at the right time, in the right way, at the right place, actually requires quite a lot of work from the sort of organizers and campaigners on the ground to supply enough information to help businesses vet and assess opportunities for especially advocacy. So we kind of set ourselves up to scratch that itch for both the businesses and the campaigners that really do want businesses to take up their issues and to be on their side and to be effective allies kind of at the table with them. I came to this place actually from working as a lawyer. I have spent my career working as a lawyer defending death penalty cases. Despite the accent, I'm actually a dual national, and so sometimes when I work with businesses, I joke that I have spent vastly more time in prisons and jails than I have in boardrooms or offices. But that is kind of our secret sauce. We are we're a sort of trusted voice on the ground, and we work really closely sort of hand in hand with both campaign organizations and with businesses. And the result is clear impact. I think it's very hard for businesses to see where the thing that they have done has created change. And so we sort of really make sure that the levers are laid down in exactly the right place, and that businesses get that feedback, that they don't just sort of throw things into the well with a campaign organization, that they have their hand held through the whole sort of concierge service, almost through the whole process. But I think that's a good description of what we're up to. Andrew, back to you.
Lovely, thank you, Celia. So we've got James in Geneva, Celia in London. We now move to the beautiful Greek island of Hydra to welcome Pavlina Proteo, the founder and CEO of Beyond CSR. Pavlina, over to you to introduce yourself.
Well, my background is in politics and macroeconomics. So, I've worked a lot in international organizations, banking institutions, financial institutions, EU projects. And it was especially through EU projects that we worked a lot on the social entrepreneurship, sustainability, CSR, underprivileged group of population, and financial inclusion, that I realized the massive potential of CSR as a budget of a corporation that remains relatively unexplored. And I was wondering why it's not pilot tool for a key sustainability strategy. So at a certain point, I founded Beyond CSR in the UK, and Beyond CSR has two phases. The first phase that it was all the startup test, forming a team, and realizing actually the challenges of the domain as we work a lot with, we're big data, big social data based. So we harness the power of big social data in order to actively and impactfully come with solutions that are shaped by people. And we work both bottom up and top down. And it was an era that, despite the fact that corporations preach innovation, they practice it in day to day, but not when it comes to innovative ideas, especially grassroots ideas. So the first era ended up in writing off, and then it was the second era that coincided with the COVID, almost the COVID outbreak. But that it was for us. The challenge, it was less challenging in the sense that corporations had started realizing that sustainability should be a key strategy. The challenges are massive, and the CSR budget that globally accounts for around $20 billion is a massive tool to bring innovative ideas, work bottom up, top down, use it as a means of building private and public partnerships, and lead actually to systemic change, and in effect redefine in a way economic sustainability. It's after all, it's empathy economics, has this holistic approach, and CSR allows you, gives you the space to work on that level. So this is pretty much what we do. We work with academia, with foundations, with funds. We have a CTO for that, as we rely a lot on big data, AI, machine learning, and in exponential technologies as a whole, and fintech. So basically, this is what we do, and we have the consulting and a lot of labs and webinars that bring diverse stakeholders together.
Great, thank you, Pavlina. What I thought we'd do now is we'd break the afternoon into 4 sections. Firstly, we would discuss and talk about the single best and the single worst example in recent years you've seen of CSR in your relevant areas of expertise in large organizations, the organizations that employ our schools MBAs. Then secondly, I thought we would look at the last 12 months and 2 very big issues, obviously the impact on CSR of COVID-19, but also on social issues such as Black Lives Matter. Then thirdly, we'll talk about best practice and ideas to support business schools in helping their students make an impact through learning. And then finally, the Q&A at the end, which I'll leave plenty of time for. You, James, first. You're an ex-guy from a major multinational, so you've seen both sides of the fence. What's the best example of impact and implementation you've seen in recent years within a large organization? And also, what was the worst?
So it's a difficult question because there are so many different facets of sustainability. So the companies that are doing very well on the environmental side may be doing less well on the social side. And even within the environmental side and the social side, you've got so many different facets. So if you look at the whole range of the Sustainable Development Goals, there are some companies that are doing very well in leveraging their particular set of skills as an organization, or leveraging their particular set of technologies and innovations to tackle a particular goal. But then they may not have grasped the concept that they need to consider the whole spectrum of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals and all of the different facets there.
But isn't that an issue that actually you can't tackle? No business school, no individual, even no multinational can really tackle all 17 SDGs at once. So is your view perhaps you should choose 3 or 4 or 5 and really try and make a difference with those?
Yes, I think you really need to understand where you're best positioned to drive positive impacts. But at the same time, you need to understand how you're also driving negative impacts. So it's fine to focus on the areas where we have a new technology or we have a new product or service that's going to revolutionize the way that people in developing countries gain access to digital technology, for example. But in providing that technology, and in your supply chain, you have instances of child labor or forced labor, then you're having, although you're creating a positive effect, you're also creating a negative effect, which is an equally large barrier. So it's about getting that balance right. And when we talk about that prioritization process of understanding where you have to focus your sustainability efforts, what is often called the materiality process. As you're doing that prioritization process, it has to be what we call principled prioritization, in a way that's prioritization based on your impacts, based on how you're currently interacting with a lot of these issues, and making sure that you're not just looking for new positive impacts, but also mitigating a negative impact. And a company that is constantly referred to as doing great on that front is Unilever. They are by far and away the champions in the space. They released earlier in the year their new climate strategy and their sort of intentions to become a more regenerative business. But they've also released just this week a new position on livelihoods, committing to pay everyone in their value chain a living wage. So going far beyond the 4 walls of their own organization, but really reaching out into all of their interactions to drive positive impacts across a wide variety of different areas. So they are constantly held up as the the leaders in this space, but they also recognize as well that there are areas that they need to improve on, and their human rights report, which came out last week, also identifies a number of areas that they want to improve on. And then it's often a tricky issue, and I'll wrap up in a second, but it's also a tricky issue to look at geographically often as well, because a lot of times these conversations are a lot more advanced if you look at sort of the who are recognized as the leaders on indices like CDP or others, or FTSE4Good. It tends to be the European companies that are out in front in terms of practice. I think Corporate Knights came out, which is a ranking of businesses in terms of their sustainability performance, came out this week. And it was European companies, I think, had 46% of the top 100 slots were European companies. The American companies were slightly further behind, but the Asian companies, a little bit of a lag there as well. So there is a regional gap that occurs, and whether that's through access to the latest thinking, or it's the trends, or some cultural differences, there are all those sorts of barriers to overcome too. So I won't point out one company in particular that's bad, but I think companies that just focus narrowly on one area are the ones that are probably lagging furthest behind, and think that all they have to do is, because they're a particular type of company, have to tackle one area. I would say that's not enough, and it's important to take that holistic view.
You talk about some markets geographically being different. We've got 55,000 Amber and BGA student members, and some of those in certain countries are saying to me, we want to do good, but it's very frustrating because in our country, corruption is a big issue, even at government level, and there is some cynicism about this whole area. What would you say to those students to try and overcome that in more difficult countries?
No, it's a really good question, and we are seeing a leveling out. I think this was more of an issue 5 or so years ago. If you look at the raft of net zero commitments coming out in the last 6 months, so governments like the Japanese government, the Korean government, the Chinese government, changing their positions quite substantially from where they were a year ago, to all saying we're now targeting net zero by 2020. And that sends a very strong message to the business communities, not only in those particular countries, but in the supply chains all across Southeast Asia that are very tied into those countries as well. Sends an important messages to the governments there too. So I think we are starting to see that, particularly on the issue of climate, that sea change that we need to see. I think some of the other issues, it's going to take a little bit longer. I think human rights in particular is one that is very challenging. Can mean different things in different geographical contexts. So I think there's a lot more work to be done around the human rights side and all of the social areas. And also the issue of biodiversity is lagging behind the climate space too. So some key issues. But I think generally, the problem that a lot of those countries had before was that the government hadn't set a clear sign, and sometimes culturally in a lot of those geographies where government and business are much more closely aligned, so to say, in Europe, it can be difficult to take a position against your own government. Suicidal in some cases to take a position against your own government. So
thanks, James. Thank you.
Yeah.
Celia, it's very much the case now when we talk about multinationals in this area that, as you know, the world's top 20 multinationals have a GNP that's larger than many countries. So what have you found as very good and very poor examples in recent years in your area of social justice amongst organizations?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of focus quite narrowly, if that's okay, because I've made a couple of notes as James was speaking, and maybe call out a few different companies for the ways that they've attacked the same issue, and sort of perhaps demonstrate how there are various different ways to approach, and none of them is less valuable. So looking through my lane, which is primarily about the way justice systems operate, especially in a racially discriminate manner, and looking at America, because I think that's a place that we've all been looking at, especially in the last 12 months, for sort of police violence, racial inequality, etc. So this is probably a company that wouldn't show up on many other lists, but JP Morgan has been a very unusually brilliant ally in this space. And I think calling them out, because JP Morgan has quite effectively got the balance between an internal and an external strategy to a social issue. So looking at the justice system, JP Morgan has kind of done three things. Externally, they have taken on a very ambitious policy advocacy platform, based quite frankly on the fact that they know that they get into rooms and have conversations with social capital in a way that campaigners and sort of grassroots organizers don't. So they've quite clearly recognized what value they bring to the table and been willing to put that tool down on the table. They also published that list of policy goals with quite clear details on why they were supporting them across the country, which, we work with a lot of businesses that are involved in justice reform. And when JP Morgan published that, the emails and texts started coming in saying, oh my God, JP Morgan had just kind of raised the ceiling. And they had, and I think what they did by doing that was two things. They forced their peers to kind of raise the ceiling, and they held themselves accountable. They said, these are the policy areas that we're going to work on. We recognize that one of the problems in systems of justice is the way that governments are running justice systems, and therefore what needs to change is primarily at a legislative and a policy level. Therefore, we're going to get involved in policy, and we're going to get involved in these 10 issues, and here's the reason why. So externally, they've been very heavily involved in policy advocacy, recognizing that they have a very, very serious lever and serious political capital that wouldn't otherwise sort of be available to the movement of campaigners and activists working on the ground. And number two, externally, they've been very willing to, I would go beyond saying motivate peers to join them. Shame peers into joining them in some ways, saying like, if we're doing this, you should be doing this too. I think the biggest challenge that we face in our in my world is performative allyship. And I think that JP Morgan kind of quite literally published a way, not the way necessarily, but their way of kind of creating a blueprint for what they were going to do and why they weren't just going to post a black tile and have done with it. And then internally, they recognized that they needed to increase diversity in their workforce, and they committed to hiring 10% of their workforce from people with criminal convictions. Now, that sounds like quite a weird thing, but in America, 1 in 3 adults have a criminal conviction. The sort of justice system's gone mad in America, of which disproportionately Black and brown people are disproportionately involved. So they sort of said, we see this problem and we recognize that a practical solution to it is actually not blocking these people out of our workforce. They're a bank. They are a bank, and they are prohibited federally under law from hiring people with criminal convictions for certain roles. Again, they said, we're going to have this internal practice and policy. It's not going to be lip service, it's not going to be conversation. We're actually going to hire people to take roles to almost the maximum extent where we absolutely can. And that means that if you're a manufacturer or food good service provider or whatever it is, if a bank can do 10% of its workforce, then a car manufacturer definitely can. So I think that for me, JP Morgan sort of has this combo of external advocacy to change makers, external advocacy to their peers, and they've been very influential in getting other major American CEOs, exactly like you say, those companies that are the biggest employers and the biggest wealth generators in the country. And they've said, we recognize that we need to walk the walk as well as talk the talk, and kind of clean house and practice what we're preaching. If I can just kind of have a little runners up list, I think that they were Ben and Jerry's. We talk about, James talked about Unilever, but Ben and Jerry's has been this sort of pinnacle gold standard of social activism for a really long time. This is a company that has really baked kind of justice and equality into its fabric, into the bedrock of the company. I think that Ben and Jerry's is sort of unattainable for most businesses, and that's why I think kind of an example like JP Morgan probably feels more realistic. Porter Novelli, which is a strategic communications company, is a kind of a different service provider, right? You know, they talk about purpose. They are a purpose-driven organization, and when justice issues kind of really came to the fore, they came with absolute humility to this movement and said, we recognize that we need to, in order to advise other companies on how to talk about justice, we need to live it and breathe it and see it and understand it. And I think what Porter Novelli did really well, which I really like, was they wanted to hear from people that had experienced the justice system. And I think if this is one of the messages that I would kind of deliver here, if you're talking about social impact, then you must be hearing from people who are impacted by the thing that you're trying to change in society, right? If we're talking about poverty, then you need to be talking to people that have experienced poverty. If you're talking about the justice system, then you need to talk to people that have experienced have been incarcerated, or who have had family members that are incarcerated, or for example, who have had family members murdered and therefore been involved in from the sort of victim's perspective. So I think that Porter came to us with this really clear mandate that they, in order to understand this, they needed to kind of go deep. And I think that that is something that I think that that's been a solution to a lot of businesses on just. I know we're going to talk about, you know, Black Lives Matter, but like this came out of nowhere for some businesses and they weren't prepared. And I think some of the businesses that responded really well were the ones that said, we are going to take the time to learn, and then did take the time to learn. I think Porter being a really good example. Final example probably would be Virgin. So this is where you've got a CEO who's been an advocate for the reverse, for whom justice issues came out of the nowhere. You know, Richard Branson has been very, very, very involved in the death penalty in particular for a very long time. But what I think is interesting for me, the sort of gold standardness of what Richard does is he will equally say yes to very splashy public things and things that aren't public and won't get him any brand credibility at all. And I think, you know, that's when, you know, he will write private letters, he will host private events, and he doesn't sort of need the badge, you know, of being a good egg to the criminal justice reform movement. And I think that that's when CEO advocacy really is effective, is when it's awesome when they share a podium. You know, he will be speaking at South by Southwest on these issues, and he's sharing the podium with someone who is innocent and sent to death row, an exoneree of death row. Like, he gets the platform, he shares it with someone with direct experience. This is kind of like the gold standard. Hosted an event with my organization on Monday that was completely closed doors and private. He won't get any recognition from that, but he recognizes that both are equally valuable and important. And I think sometimes when we talk about purpose and brand, it gets very mixed up with comms, you know, and I think that that's fine, that's good. Businesses should be rewarded for doing the right thing. But if you're really going to be involved in an issue and kind of tackle it, you need to recognize that there's work going on below the visible line too. Iceberg, there's a lot of work that needs to happen as well.
Okay, so JP Morgan is a very interesting case to name, because if you look at our business schools and their graduating students, historically the two most popular areas of employment for MBAs has been consultancy and financial services. So it sounds like they're really bringing the whole CSR side into financial services, which has not been perhaps had the best reputation in that field. So good for them. So actually, if you're a socially responsible graduate, but you do want to be an investment banker or something in financial services, JP Morgan be a pretty good choice. And you think they're bringing the rest of the industry up with them?
Definitely bringing the rest of the industry up with them. I mean, they've just sort of set this bar that's pretty high, and other businesses sort of need to catch up. You know, what I like about them is it's not just philanthropy. You know, they're not just writing checks. They are actually, you know, rolling up their sleeves and taking the caps off their pens. You know, I'm obviously only speaking from my field of vision, but my field of vision, yeah, they're the real deal. They're actually doing what they said they're going to do, and having, you know, I can see where they've had impact when they get involved in campaigns. And, you know, some of that's visible and some of it's not. And so I think, you know, they get that kind of stamp of approval from me, from that, you know, death penalty defense lawyer advocate on the ground. You know, I think that should be that should be the standard that businesses are looking to attain. Obviously, you need customers. Obviously, you want profit. But like when the organizers and campaigners on the ground, if you're involved in a campaign, what you want is that text to go around the group saying, "Oh my God, you know, they made a huge difference," and that was the thing that changed it. We were involved in a campaign in Ohio, in the state of Ohio. Ending the use of juvenile life without parole, which doesn't even exist anywhere outside America. It is literally what it sounds like. Children going to prison for life. They will never go before a parole board. They never get to even argue that they should be eligible for parole. And year on year, this particular piece of legislation had come up and never quite kind of cleared the hurdles that it needed to clear. This year, actually towards the end of last year, businesses got on board in a really big way. Local businesses, not necessarily big businesses, and pretty conservative businesses, and not your sort of social impact businesses, but they just got it, and they got that it was wrong, and they were sort of well organized. Like, you know, we supported them basically. I think that can sometimes be a big barrier. Like, yeah, we'd love to be involved, but realistically, I don't have time to draft an op-ed or place it, or, you know, whip round my friends and get 10 people to sign on to a letter or whatever it is. So, you know, we kind of took that friction out of it. And the result was 2 weeks ago, the state of Ohio signed into law a piece of legislation that ends juvenile life without parole. And that text went round the campaign movement, that this is what had made a difference in this. And I think it is rare that you see that, like, here's where we started, here's where we ended up, and the difference was businesses. But in that example, you definitely can. And I think that's what businesses should be striving for. And I think that's especially what millennials, if you're a business worried about recruitment and retention of millennials, that's what they want. They want a company that they can feel proud has been an instrument or a catalyst to creating some change.
No, totally agree. Last point, do you know if either Ben & Jerry's or JP Morgan have issued a sort of blueprint of how they've done what they've done that perhaps some of our delegates here today could see or refer to?
Yeah, not really is the answer, actually. And so we actually did it. We published a toolkit on our website. It's a very kind of slimmed down version, but it's basically like 8 ways that businesses could get involved in justice issues, because this is where, I mean, it's pretty replicable for most social issues. And then gave loads of concrete examples, because actually that was a thing that hadn't really ever happened. We were talking before we came online about, you know, when we'll be together again, when we'll conference again. And that's a big goal of ours as an organization, to actually get the leaders in this space, business leaders in our space, together, because that's the thing that's not really for those businesses that are involved in changing justice systems and in increasing justice and reducing injustice, if you want to kind of put it as simply as that, to kind of get together and peer-to-peer learn. I think there's a huge appetite for it. And there's obviously sort of no one way to approach this issue. So that's definitely like a sort of businesses engaged in justice 2.0. And I think it will happen a lot this year. I think those businesses that were visibly and well prepared for 2020 and racial and social injustice suddenly really shot to the top of the pack and were very visibly involved in tackling those issues, and will have a lot of lessons to share with colleagues and peers.
Brilliant, very interesting, thank you. Pavlina, over to you. You're muted, Pavlina.
What I've just heard from Celia, it was really music to my ears, because I would like to talk about the challenges we've faced, because in this territory, there are best practices, there are worst practices, but the worst part, I think that the challenging part is the way lots of corporations still view sustainability out of a PR activity rather than a core activity. And she mentioned time and again, CEOs should be CEO level, should be the umbrella strategy, the only strategy actually. And then you have CSR and you have that budget and you use it in the best ways to come out with a positive, measurable impact, because impact has to be measured. It's not just adopting initiatives and corporate philanthropy is well beyond corporate philanthropy. Actually, I'm not really I kind of don't like the corporate philanthropy term, because at the end it's too one-off and with not an actual impact, and CSR is there to progress, to accelerate, should be there to accelerate sustainability strategies, but it has to be part of a core business development, not a marketing division. This is how you come with actual impact, and social impact is it's part of sustainability. We talk sustainable development, and we talk sustainability and social impact as two different things is one thing. If you have concrete sustainable strategies, then you come with measurable social impact, environmental impact. And one of the problems is that corporations face it like ticking the box. It's the same with the ESG factors. They're game changers, but if your approach is like, we tick the box and we did it, you'll never come with a desirable outcome. We work mostly up to now because they were more friendly to listen to what we have to say. Plus, we're set up as an organization, we're social enterprise, our legal form, because we believe that we believe a lot in social entrepreneurship. Also, that the for-profit sector should adopt a lot of the principles of social enterprises and social entrepreneurship. And we have started working with funds and educational institutions, because as justice, education is key, and lifelong learning, because Celia mentioned the millennials, but you also have the Generation X. What you do with them, they have to learn, unlearn, relearn. And one of the problems with CSR departments is that they have these prefixed ideas that we have, and the policy is like one suit fits all. We had a project about generating jobs for the ages over 50. Guess what? At the end, nothing happened, because the trend was for youth entrepreneurship. So you need to listen to what society needs, and what society needs is diversity and inclusion, and that has to come as a directive from above. So diversity and inclusion also leads to better environmental policies. It's sustainability has this holistic approach of connecting the dots, aligning the environmental. It's the triple bottom: environment, society, and people, planet, profit. And CSR should be that. And as James said before, there are some organizations that outperform in environmental issues and some outperform in social, but the soft point is usually the social affairs is where most of organizations have a problem. And you both mentioned basically transparency. It's a value creation system, and CSR can help on that direction, on value creation, on building ethical models, dragging best practices. It could be the impact investment tool of organization.
Very good. All right. Thank you, Pavlina. So that we've got enough time for the questions, and also particularly the teaching within business schools, I'm just going to invert the business school section next before COVID. And a question here, which I'd like each of you to answer in turn, is how do you believe business schools should be teaching their students so that they can be responsible and ethical leaders, both the hard skills needed, but also the soft skills? James, starting with you.
Sure. So I think for me, the short answer is to make sure that the topic of sustainability is not siloed in I think we had my MBA, it was siloed in a week-long what's it called, Dealing with Society course or something, that gave an example of, I think the example we had, the case study we had, was Playboy magazine trying to open in Indonesia, and how they failed to understand the social implications of what they were doing. And that was it, really. Had that 1 week of how business interacts with government, society, and everything sort of shoehorned into that one piece. And then everything else was very sort of pure play, management accounting, management strategy, corporate behaviors, etc., etc. But the golden thread of sustainability wasn't running through everything. So I think the reality of the world we live in today is that businesses in the long term will only be successful businesses if they are operating sustainably. And all governments moving in that direction, and societal expectations moving very strongly in that direction as well. There's lots of calls going on at the World Economic Forum this week for complete resets of our capitalist model, complete resets of the way financial markets work, the way financial markets value sustainable business behavior. So I would encourage business schools to start to echo that and to incorporate sustainability related topics into the class on, financial accounting, or into the class on strategy, into the class on some of the human resource related discussions that happen. So I think that's where it really comes to life, is that this is a topic that touches everything you do as a business. And it should be something that is, that purpose that we've talked about should be something that runs through all of these different functions, and those functions should be in support of that purpose.
And do you believe that they should be taught best, most effectively in case studies, or in actual visits into real life situations, or a mix of things? What's the balance?
Yeah, I think case studies are a great way of learning these things. Also, hearing directly from some of the companies is also pretty useful if you can get that sort of human interaction, if we are ever able to have human interaction again, which hopefully we are. If you can hear from somebody who's working on these issues, it's much more powerful than reading about the case study that happened years ago. But I think that the case studies are becoming increasingly clear now, and particularly on the negative impact side. So the stories of companies that have seen a direct P&L impact of unsustainable behavior, or have seen a direct boycott because of their failure to tackle a social issue sufficiently. And I think those are the sorts of case studies we should be pulling out, not just the sort of the typical case studies that we see, which focus mainly on how this company was able to turn this into this much profit.
Okay, thank you, James. And Celia, over to you. Also in the context of how do you teach, how can a business school best teach the lessons to be learned from Black Lives Matter?
And there's so much what James said that I was just kind of nodding and agreeing with. I think from a pure sort of dollars and cents perspective, I think one of the lessons that we've learned is that, companies that extract from communities, that are extractive of communities, will always be more risky, and even if that is only because they are subject to the winds of political change. We've seen in the last week or so a new administration in the United States, and private prison contracts have just been ended. So I think that that there is a sort of financial sort of P&L approach, to things like human rights and social impact, and that's been seen in the US in the last 12 months, and in an enormous way, but if we want to boil this down to like, how do you teach this to people? How do you expose this to people in an MBA context? James, I completely echo, look at profit through the lens of social impact. Don't have a sort of class on social impact, but actually integrate, social impact issues throughout, all components of a course. If companies sort of don't invest in communities, and they're extractive communities, you can't do anything without people. You can't build widgets, you can't build houses, you can't sell widgets, you can't sell, you need people to be sort of supportive of this. And I think that there is this reputational issue. Cancel culture is a really clear example of that. That if you get this wrong, reputational damage can be can affect the bottom line of a company. I think one more thing on this, folding out of Black Lives Matter is, diversity isn't like a passport or a key to a door. Like it should be the bedrock of good teams. You know, even on my own sort of micro scale, running a non-profit organization, the strength of our team lies in the diversity of experience, of culture, of ethnicity, of gender of our own organization. And I think, you know, to continually look at each aspect of an MBA program through these lenses to the extent possible, it'll actually create more sustainable business in the long run. You can actually create businesses that are less risky and sort of more future proof in the long run. I think I sort of definitely believe that's true. That's not just the sort of aspirational wishes of a frontline, you know, campaign organizer or whatever you want to call me, you know, somebody from the front lines, I suppose. Like, I think that, you know, cancel culture is just like one symptom of what will come when businesses kind of don't align with the purpose and values of the people that they're employing, they're selling to. And I think that there's probably more of that to come. I think one of the things that businesses will really need to face, I've seen one of the questions, or I know we'll get to them, is how they're being held to account. And I think they will be, you know, really held to account. The concept of kind of building back better post-COVID, the foot is sort of not coming off the gas pedal with businesses on holding them to account over how they react to things like racial inequality and social inequality.
So, James, you mentioned Unilever. Celia, you mentioned Ben & Jerry's and JP Morgan, all companies that our MBA students would love to join. How does the business school and separately the student indicate in their application that they're really strong in this area of CSR to appeal to those CSR-oriented multinationals? How do you do that?
I think MBA students need to have direct experience of this. You know, if you were to sit down, I mean, we are in the process of creating like a curriculum and a learning program for businesses, but there's no reason why it shouldn't be business students. And it is populated with the wisdom and the voices and the storytelling, frankly, of people that have experienced the thing that we're trying to teach them about. You know, James talked about case studies. Maybe in my world and in my work, it's quite black and white, right? How do you teach somebody about what it is like to experience the justice system? You get people to come and who have experienced the justice system to tell those stories. And I think, you know, if we're talking about soft skills, you know, things like empathy are really important soft skills, and you can't develop empathy unless you've learned and heard about something in quite a practical way. Like, you can read statistics all you want about how many Black people go to prison, but it's only when you sit in front of a Black man who tells you spent 28 years on death row for a crime you didn't commit that you really kind of think, okay, there's some fire in my belly to create some change here. And I think it's those, like, you know, it's those visceral experiences, and it's getting in the words of, there's a great campaigner in the United States called Brian Stevenson. He says, get proximate. You have to get proximate to these issues to actually understand them and to kind of embed them in your psyche for the long run. Otherwise, it's an interesting hour, you know, in a panel event or an interesting course that you took about justice and injustice. But I think unless you hear from people who have directly experienced that, it's not going to kind of really bed deep in somebody. And actually the best businesses, because we work with businesses, obviously we sit down and we're like, you know, they kind of want us to come to them and say, what's on the menu of stuff that we could do to be helpful to change injustice in America or in wherever we're working. And actually the best businesses are the ones where you talk to them. Normally what we do is we start talking to them and educating them, getting them a bit proximate to the justice system. And then they come to us and say, these are the things that we think are on the menu, because obviously they have much better insight into what their business can do and how it could actually be valuable to create change than we ever could from the outside. So the best thing that we can do with those businesses is show them what the problems are, and then they start to begin to have ideas about how they can be part of the solution.
And so would the three of you be advocating that on a traditional MBA program, in addition to the company visit to Amazon or Google, which obviously makes sense, that maybe there should be a prison visit as part of, or even if it was possible, and instead a death row visit, if you really want to get to understand and make a difference on justice, for example.
Definitely. I mean, this is my lane, and obviously there's lots of different social issues, but yeah, definitely. And I actually think that probably would be one of the most interesting, great example of this happening to someone. Like, talk about Ken Frazier, the CEO of Merck. And to this day, you know, when he's interviewed for like New York Times corner office piece, he talks about a case that he worked on pro bono, death penalty case he worked on pro bono, as the most important thing he's done in his career.
Wow.
And he's the CEO of a huge pharmaceutical company, right? And it's probably in the grand scheme of his career, this was probably a fraction of a second, right? And he probably worked on it for 1, maybe 2 years. But I absolutely think, you know, what has happened with Ken Frazier is he's had proximity. That's a big investment of time to like represent somebody. But in a micro scale, can you do a teeny version of that with exactly like you say, like a prison visit? And then the MBA program, if I'm an MBA program administrator, I'm probably thinking, oh my God, how on earth do I take a bunch of students down to a prison or a jail? Like, how do you even facilitate that, right? Well, then you need partnerships with nonprofit organizations like ours that will say, yeah, we can do that in a heartbeat. Don't worry. Where do you want to go? Do you want to go to Indiana? Do you want to go to Texas? You know, it's just sort of, it's all possible from a sort of practical implementation level. I mean, this is sort of our organization. We're not a big fan of like big ideas unless there's some sort of concrete step by step, and this is like how you get to the point of that big idea being a real thing. But yeah, I definitely think so. That proximity needs to be baked in. Whatever the issue is, bake in some proximity, and your students won't forget it. And then they'll start to be good ambassadors for all social justice issues within their own organization. They'll start putting up their hand and saying, why do we have minimum balance requirements for a bank account? Because this means that in some communities, people can't open a bank account. And like, they're the great questions, right? That's when change begins to happen.
We'll come on to that in a minute, actually, because there's a question around that. Pavlina.
Yeah, actually, I was thinking empathy nonstop because sustainability is problem solving. You have to respond to challenges, global challenges, from injustice, from access to education, from access to safe drinking water that around 1 billion of people cannot. So, as an empathy model, it needs empathy tools. So at a business school, I come from policy and governance. So basically, I'm not an MBA. I've never been a business student, but I work with CEOs, and they all come from business schools, and that's a problem. Empathy. You need to walk into somebody else's shoes. So it means you go to the ground. If you want to talk unemployment, go to welfare associations that deal with unemployed. If you want to talk about extreme poverty, go down the street and see the homeless. And it's something that it needs more experimental point of view in this education, in business education, because this is the way to efficiently respond to the challenges that we face. It's a non-stop challenge. So in problem solving, you need the approach that's going to respond to a problem rather than talk the talk. You have to walk the talk, but in order to walk the talk, you need to understand how a poor feels, how someone that loses a job feels, how a woman, let's go to gender issues, feels being underpaid. We know what equality in payment for women is going to come according to a study published by the World Economic Forum. It's going to take, give or less, around 2 centuries before women achieve full equal payment. So you need to create that empathy, so you have the understanding of the problem, because otherwise, like map exercises, and this, and there are tools for that. I mean, you could include applied theater techniques in order to raise empathy. They do that in CEOs, in coaching CEOs, in order to increase their empathy.
Sure. Let's stay on the issue of poverty. There's two things. There's teaching poverty resolution, and there's actually the school itself making an impact within their own country. James, starting with you, how do you think that a business school can help reduce poverty in its own country?
I guess there's a number of different routes you could go down. I think there's obviously the philanthropic side that is an option, but then in the longer term, I guess it's making, I don't know, business schools I think have a role to play in making business people more well-rounded individuals who are more attuned to these sorts of issues, and therefore are able to leverage the innovation and the power of businesses that they will be eventually involved in to tackle these issues more substantially. And it's a bit like a grander scale, teach someone to fish, they'll fish for a lifetime.
Yeah.
Thing then. So I think if you are able to distill this message down, and really, why does business exist? Business exists to meet social needs. If business isn't fulfilling a social need, there's really no reason for it to exist. This is how the paradigm is shifting in this new conversations about stakeholder capitalism. If business is just creating value for shareholders, why is that business still being accepted by society? Business has to deliver some sort of societal need, and a clear need out there is addressing a lot of these issues around poverty. And when we say poverty is this sort of broad catch-all, but there's huge swathes of inequality out there across a wide range of different issues, like things like access to education, healthcare, affordable housing, all issues that are eminently solvable by innovative new business models that could be deployed. So again, I think developing an awareness of these issues is critical. So then you can take what business is great at, which is innovation and scaling up solutions and deploying resources. All these things can be then deployed in the areas that the needs exist. And then you have the potential for public-private collaboration in those areas too. So I would say there's a lot that businesses can do to understand the needs of their own communities, connecting students with those needs, looking for programs that can support them, but more broadly and more potentially with more long-term and more impact is to bring those issues, as Celia was saying, bring those issues into the heart of the organization in terms of, we have sessions in MBAs about understanding economics, understanding the current global socio-political outlook. The sustainability issue should be part of that discussion. It's important to know about what these issues are in your own community particularly, but also more broadly. And then once that awareness is there, hopefully that can lead to more solutions emerging.
And so would you favour business schools actually getting their students involved in projects in the local community? I mean, some of our schools in Africa and Latin America do this very well, rather than go on a project with Google or Apple, which of course is attractive to MBAs because it's leading edge. They go into an area of great poverty and work with the local community to try and bring some wealth to that area. In fact, one of our top schools in India, the MBAs in their first semester have to go and do a project in a poor Indian village their first semester. And interestingly, the dean told me that for many of those students, it's the first time they've ever been into a poor Indian village in their own country.
No, that's fantastic. I mean, that sounds just the sort of thing that we need to see happening. And this idea that, a lot of MBAs or people signing up to business school don't necessarily go to business school because they want to work for one of the big companies either. There's a lot of it is driven by this desire for entrepreneurship as well. This idea of wanting to start something yourself and to tackle, provide a service yourself and grow that service. I think the idea of social entrepreneurship is really, really growing, and particularly with the younger generations, and saying, look, how can I use my education and my skills to tackle a particular social issue? And raising awareness of those social issues raises the playing field, I think, or for people to then to explore where to apply the skills they've learned in a way that gives them purpose and also gives them career satisfaction.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the dilemmas that some of our careers and development staff face is our students have spent a lot of money on their MBA, anything between $10,000 and $100,000. And understandably, they're looking to get that paid back, because increasingly corporations aren't sponsoring them. Increasingly, they're paying most or all of it themselves. And also they're looking for a good salary because it's supposed to boost their careers. So the ideal was you can go into Ben & Jerry's or JP Morgan or Unilever, and you'll get paid a good commercial salary coming through. But what about those who want from the outset to come into the not-for-profit world and work in not-for-profits? Do you think that even though people care passionately, do you think salaries in charities are a problem for high-flying individuals who, it's not their main motivation, but want a good living? Or are you now finding that people are making a decent living, a decent wage, running charities too?
That for me, Andrew?
For all three of you, whoever.
Well, I mean, as the person that runs one, I can say that, you know, the third sector is dreadful for salaries. I think it's changing. I think that there are leaders like, don't get me wrong, our salaries aren't like, you know, crazy, but because we work at the intersection of business and human rights or social impact, you know, our staff come from business backgrounds, a lot of them. And so we needed competitive salaries. And so we've put quite a lot of our resources, like quite a high amount of our budget goes into paying people appropriately to their skill level. But I think our organization is very unusual for that. And I face questions about that to funders, you know, and to philanthropic donors about, you know, why some of my staff are on higher than, you know, basic living wage salaries. That needs to change. I think one of the very interesting things that I see law schools in America, you know, equivalent in many ways to MBA students, is loan repayment or loan forgiveness for students that go into, in the case of law, into the legal aid sector. So for, you know, my previous organization I ran was a nonprofit law firm, and one of my members of staff was a Harvard law graduate, and Harvard actually paid her loan back, her student loan back, or a very significant portion of her student loan, while she worked for me, because of the area of that she was working in. And I hired her near enough out of law school, probably a couple of years out of law school. And if she hadn't had that, she would not have been able to afford to work for me, with me, you know, because that sort of the loan amount per month would have meant that she would have had to have gone to like a white shoe, you know, fancy city law firm, because she just would have needed that salary. So I think what we see in the nonprofit sector is quite a lot of people come out of the for-profit sector after about 10 years, exhausted and wanting to do something with more purpose, which is crazy, because I think quite a lot of MBA graduates are probably waiting. You know, they go off and they work somewhere and then they wait until they can come and work at an organization like mine. And actually, we're probably not talking about a vast sum of money in the grand scheme of things to support students wanting to start working. There is a really big problem with non-profit organizations not hiring graduates, because graduates can't afford to work for us. And also, we sometimes don't have the ability, our teams are too small to train them. So I think things like secondments and a year in a non-profit supported is really important. And I think that those positions have to be supported. I mean, I come from a privileged background, but even still, I would never have been able to take an unpaid job anywhere at any point in my career. And I think that if working for a non-profit straight out of university was what I had really wanted to do, basically was in many respects, but and the key to the door was an unpaid internship, I just wouldn't have been able to get that key to the door. So I think thinking really, my university actually helped me by paying for me they paid me to do unpaid internships.
Brilliant.
And that was because I literally asked them. They had no formal process for it, but I just wrote to somebody at Oxford and said, how on earth is somebody from my background able to do unpaid legal internships? And they said, you're right, how much money do you need to cover you for a summer of doing unpaid legal internships? And I wrote them a budget and they gave it to me. But I think that you have to be exceptionally entrepreneurial in order to have that kind of insight. But maybe if you know, if business schools made it easier and said, these are the endowments or grant program that we have for people who want to go spend 6 to 12 months working, you know, in a non-profit organization, they help us and they help the student. That's really realistic from our side in terms of giving those students a sort of opportunity to do a bit of this first before they go into their role at JP Morgan or Google or wherever it is.
Okay, there's a question related to some of these internships here, and it's a good question. I'm going to ask it now. Celia has discussed trailblazing employers, but MBAs have clear ideas of the corporates they want to see and hear from and where they want to work. Considering partnerships, internships, how far should the business school be responsible for vetting and potentially vetoing the organizations with whom they work in terms of diversity, sustainability, corporate slavery, etc.? How can business schools genuinely put purpose and planet before profit? Is this realistic?
It should be realistic. If we are to talk sustainability strategies, it should be. Impact investing, for example, is thriving. ESG investing is surging. It's a quest. There is even the corporate world is in turn making a shift towards impact investing in the wider sense, impact strategies. We can't put profit before planet and people if we are to talk sustainability by default. It's in the DNA of the very sustainability model, what we're talking about. But that doesn't mean that we don't make profit. It is that the profit is not extreme, is not greed, because we tend to confuse profit with greed. No, you can make profit. And there is another thing. Celia mentioned the third sector. Social entrepreneurship is part of the third sector. It's not just NGOs. And the problem is that for a lot of the corporate or major part of the corporate world, they view social entrepreneurship something like an expensive hobby or an NGO. It's not. You make profit, you have to make profit, and it's even more difficult to make profit than typical for profit, because you have to convince that this is the model. You just choose that you give back to society, to the environment. You have principles, you have values, and you have ethics. And sustainability is about building sets of values and ethics. If there's ethics is paramount, and impact investing is about ethical investing at the end of the day. So MBA schools should be the pioneers on that quest for this new model that we have to shift. I mean, it's the MBA schools actually, because some things are top down, not everything is bottom up, unfortunately. So the MBA schools could be the pioneers in the quest for a paradigm shift.
Yeah, I think taking notes from the ESG community is exactly where I would have answered that question too. I mean, in the process of an investor seeking disclosures from a company, there's no reason why you couldn't ask a company, for example, do you use prison labor, right? And I think that screening process could equally apply to MBAs. You know, if you are going to be sending students to, for example, JP Morgan, why couldn't you ask for a set of disclosures that are along CSR or sustainability guidelines? And, you know, do you steer a student towards it or away from it based on, you know, how it falls on, for example, like a traffic light system? I don't know, yeah. But at least you equip students with that information and say, if you're going to go and work for this bank or this company or this, you know, manufacturer or whatever it is, like, here's where they're doing really well and here's where they're not. You know, maybe in some ways from our perspective, sending really highly motivated young people into companies that are failing on CSR is a really interesting prospect, because then they're not like, maybe that person will actually create change within that organization. But as long as they go in with their eyes wide open, right, as to what that what that company's record is and on human rights, on the environment, etc.
You can see a business school's dilemma, though, in actually vetoing a company.
Yeah, I
Here
wouldn't.
we are in the toughest labour market with a lot of talented MBAs not able to find the job they want, and business schools feeling themselves under pressure to get those good jobs. It's a bold school that would veto a multinational.
Yeah, I think somewhere in between is more like a disclosure system, a disclosures and an information system. Because actually that will, when a company has to fill out that formal, it will probably motivate them to do a little bit better, because they don't want to tell, you know, Stanford Business School that they have a very good record on a particular social, you know, social impact issue, for example. It's all about creating a race to the top rather than shaming the ones at the bottom, really.
Yeah, no, good point. There's some really great questions here, so I'm going to continue rolling into the questions now. And there's a question here, which I'll then just quote a statistic before I'd like you to answer. So, do you think business schools should be putting pressure on governments, in regard to climate change governance? And I'll quote you the research that I quoted earlier. In answering the question, how do business school leaders rate the following groups on their efforts to prevent climate change, only 29% of deans and directors of business schools thought that governments were in any way doing a positive job in impacting climate change. It is incredibly low, and that was a big research project. So what should business schools be doing to influence government? James, do you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I'll have a crack. I think governments are under pressure from all sides at the moment. I think if you look at the latest Edelman Trust Barometer that came out this week, you see trust in governments is at an all-time low, whereas actually people are looking at business to provide a lot of the solutions to some of the challenges we're facing around climate, much more than they are governments at the moment. So businesses have filled that void of leadership that unfortunately we've been seeing from some of the leading governments in recent years. Hopefully tides are turning. So I think obviously we all need to put pressure on government for business schools as much as there is for anybody else. But I think probably at the moment there's a bigger role for business schools to work with the business community to fulfill that potential and the expectation that is there for business, as well as that, you know, the role that we all have as organizations to engage with our governments, proactively around these issues.
Do you think it's true that some universities think that it's the science division rather than the business school division or any other that should be leading the charge on climate change? Or is it not the case that actually it's the science division working with the business division that actually creates the products that'll make the difference?
Yeah, I mean, it's one thing getting the products there, but then it's all the other business machination that has to happen around that, the financing, the deployment, the scaling. So it's very, very business skill related. And if you look at things like the Green New Deal that's emerging in the European Union and all of the incentives that the Conservative Party just rolled out in the UK, these are, you know, big business opportunities. And so important that companies are equipped with the people who are able not just to help them develop the right engineering feats to enable to get this, because we have the technologies in many cases are there. It's about rolling them out. So there's a more sort of corporate minded people to try and leverage these financing streams to deploy the solutions, to scale those solutions, and to get the business rolling. So huge role for business schools to create that pipeline of expertise that's needed to do that.
I mean, similarly, Celia, is it the business school that should be demanding and leading change on justice, or should they just be leaving it to the law school?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with James. I think it's definitely, you know, perhaps informed by the law school, but it's a business school too. You know, I think this really comes down, if I was sort of put it in a word, it would probably be leverage, right? And we know that businesses have considerable social capital and leverage. You know, we talked a bit earlier about poverty and like, how do you alleviate poverty? Well, people who have meaningful employment are less likely to be under the poverty line. Fantastic, wonderful. So you give people jobs, but then you need to figure out why people aren't getting to the point of employment, right? And that's where you're starting to create change, you know. And what we're really talking about there is policy change, right? We're talking about governments stopping doing something or doing something that they're not doing in order to actually make it possible for people to get out of poverty or to not be in poverty. To use a really concrete example from my work, the way that court debt is applied in America. So if you get a ticket, right, crossing the road in America, you can get what's called jaywalking ticket, which is if you cross, I've had one. If you cross the road in the wrong place, you get a ticket for it and you have to pay. So if you pay it immediately, it's usually half the price. So if you pay it immediately, $45, if you don't, 90, or at least that's what it was in California. But then if you go to court, you then get additional fines and fees for the fact that you haven't paid the ticket initially, and you actually have to pay for the court time in some cases. If you don't pay that debt, because you can't, right? Not because you don't want to. Let's assume that a good number of people who don't pay this court debt is because they can't pay it. You get your driver's license taken away. If anyone that knows anything about America, has been to America, or has ever set foot in America, knows that outside one or two major cities like Chicago, San Francisco, and New York, if you cannot drive, you cannot get to work. So this is, you know, it's fantastic having like a company, you know, in the Everglades of Florida saying we're going to employ 100 people in the local environment. If they cannot drive to the place where you have your office or your facility or whatever it is, because they're systematically losing their driver's licenses because of unpaid court debt, well, you need to kind of remove that plug in the pipeline. This is a justice system example, but it also exists in housing, education, healthcare, exactly as James said. So tackling you know what goes on within government and how governments legislate and make policy. Our entire organization is founded on the belief that you pretty much have no longer lever and no better ally in creating change at a government level than businesses. So if we go all the way back to the beginning of your question, like I would say that the business school is more important than the law school in changing the justice system, because we can tinker around. You know, I can represent people facing the death penalty one at a time, or we can end the death penalty and then there's no need for me to continue to represent people facing the death penalty. I would much rather the latter exist, and I think businesses are more valuable than lawyers in creating that change, speaking as a lawyer.
Good point.
The same goes for poverty reduction. And business by DNA looking for impact. They want to create profit one way or another. So they know how to tackle major issues better than governments, because they also they've learned to work fast. So they would, I would rather have secondments in governments by business leaders, the same way they go to NGOs. And I sincerely believe that if the public and the private sector do not work together, we cannot have any sort of positive outcomes. And we need secondments from business leaders, from business schools to governments, being central government, regional government. You need this business way of thinking, which is productive, efficient, to the point, articulated, to be transcended to the to policymakers, politicians. It's
when it comes to rebuilding, we're talking about how you remove the clogs in the pipe as well, and how you stop bad things from happening. But on the other side of this is rebuilding something in its stead, right? And those that have attended business school have that kind of innovation and acumen and ability to create something new in its place. Speaking as a lawyer, will never have. So I doubt, businesses are sort of key stakeholders in all parts of this.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to a couple of the other questions here, because we're starting to run out of time and there's some good questions still. As consumers, we are obsessed with convenience. Do you think the onus is on the consumers demanding ethical products, or the businesses producing them by providing ethical and sustainable ways in a convenient way? What's the balance?
Fantastic question. It sort of ties into everything around marketing and product innovation as well, which is really, really key in this space. And I think the moment the the consumer won't accept it has been one of the go-to excuses for business in the sustainability space. So there's basically 4 go-to excuses. There's the technology isn't there, the government won't support it, the finance isn't there, it's not economically viable, and then the consumer doesn't want a fizzy drink bottle that is not entirely see-through, or the consumer doesn't want this, or the consumer wants as much chocolate as it can get its hand on, and sugar levels that are off the charts, leading to diabetes and obesity and all the other stuff. So there's lots of excuses out there, and the fact is that business has a critical role to play in shaping the societal outcomes through its engagement with consumers, through its marketing activities, through the types of products it's innovating, through its behaviors in lots of different ways of engaging and informing consumers. But it's also true that consumers won't just accept anything. So there's got to be proper innovation and thought around how to engage consumers around that. You can't just go to a consumer and say, this is better for you, eat this, or this is better for the planet, use this. It's 10 times more expensive, but use this. So there's got to be innovation to try and get things at the right price point, to try and get things that are better for the environment and also better for consumers. I think we're locked in many cases, in many brands, we're locked in a sort of a 1950s US model of bigger is better. I want as much steak as possible, sliced as large as possible. We all need a car, we all need a massive house. And so there's this image of success that business has contributed to, which is ingrained in a lot of sort of consumer psyche of this is what success looks like. I think a lot of the challenge around business now is to reframe what success looks like from a marketing perspective. What does a good lifestyle look like from a sustainability point of view? And make it appealing and attractive and engaging, rather than just sort of putting out the products you're already putting out and then putting out a sustainability alternative that no one will buy because it's 10 times more expensive and doesn't look as cool. So there's lots of innovation that's needed and lots of mindsets that need to be shifted, but we need to move away from traditional user success. And that's where I think business schools have a critical role to play in their marketing courses.
Yeah.
Pavlina, yeah.
Yeah, as you mentioned, because I've worked a lot with consumer issues and consumer projects, as what James said, the problem with ethical products is that they're 10 times more expensive. The mode of production is more expensive, and usually the people do not get paid any better. You know, back the people that produce the product that comes to us, and we need to redefine consumerism. On the one hand, you have this American model that James said that the more the better. We don't need it. On the other hand, people like myself that pursue ethical products, fair trade, ethical fashion, we try to check on slow fashion, etc. It's so much more expensive, and we need to kind of get to innovative ways into redefine consumerism, because the consumer does play a huge role. And there is more demand for ethical products and green products, but we need somehow to make the production of them much cheaper, more efficient, and bring new ways of putting recycling and upcycling in the picture of when we talk about ethical consumerism and redefining consumerism. You cannot redefine consumerism without putting circularity on the spot.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you very much, Pavlina. I think we'll end for the next few minutes just on talking about the impact of months, both COVID and Black Lives Matter. I mean, Black Lives Matter first. A question here. That companies were making commitments in the summer of 2020, which was a good response. Celia, do you think that organizations have started to forget about those, given all the other challenges and problems they face at the moment?
You know, I don't think they're forgetting about them, but I think that is because of consumer and people pressure. I mean, I think the sort of messaging that has come out of the last 12 months in the wake of the murder of George Floyd has been, show us your boards, you know, what are you doing internally? Silence is complicity. Has this kind of cancel culture applied? You know, I think that, it sort of went from like if businesses would do something about racial inequality to how businesses would do something about racial inequality. Some businesses have published what they're planning on doing and they will be held to account for that. You know, whether businesses press the snooze button or not, I think they probably won't be allowed to by the kind of consumer and activist community, if I'm completely honest. But yeah, I definitely think that a big challenge for organizations like mine is going to be taking businesses from performative allyship into actual, you know, impact and action. I think 50% of that is willingness, but I also think 50% of it is our side of the bargain, right? Like effective partnerships with organizations on the ground that can say, this is where we really need you, this is how we want you to help, you know, impactful. And not only resources from companies in terms of philanthropy in order to support those organizations working on the ground, but also commitment to resources within the companies. The companies that do the best on our issues are the ones that have a paid member of staff or more than one paid member of staff whose responsibility it is to like meet the KPIs that they set themselves around social justice issues. And they often hire those people from backgrounds more like mine, and those people are highly motivated to see the company do it. And then the sort of other side of that coin is buy-in from leadership, because you can hire the most brilliant and best person to run your social impact agenda or your advocacy agenda or your even sort of policy government affairs agenda, but if they're constantly fighting an advocacy battle within their own organization and having to like pick the things that they work on really carefully and run things up the chain really carefully because there's a sort of internal politics of trying to get anything done because they know leadership doesn't really like it, then they're going to, you know, they're going to be sort of at best very muted in their response. So, you know, I think the answer to like, are we passing the snooze button? Is this just performative allyship? Is still kind of TBD. But if I would be worried about assuming it was, if I was a business right now, assuming that people will go away and this is going to be forgotten about. I think it won't be.
Well said, well said. Ending on a COVID positive, because there's so much negativity around COVID. James, starting with you, what's the one positive thing you think has happened in terms of CSR that will result from a COVID world?
Be careful about saying COVID positive.
Yeah, indeed. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I think there's a few things. I think first of all is it's exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, particularly on the social side that we won't talk about. Good language from the UN coming out. The COVID's been an X-ray that's exposed fractures in our social skeleton, I think it was, which I quite liked. And so now opportunities to focus on those. I think it's also given an insight into the type of disruption we could be facing if threats like climate change and biodiversity loss reach tipping points and come to a scale where they're affecting us globally. So we've had a sort of a snapshot into what the future might look like if we don't take action on things. It's an opportunity now also with the stimulus packages that are coming together to realize some of the systemic transformations that we need to drive forward sustainable development. So on the energy side and other areas, there's this inflection point, this time for thinking and planning. And if we're going to stimulate the economy, the green revolution, if you like, is a perfect way to do that.
Great, thank you. And last word, Pavlina, to you. What do you see that's positive that'll come out for CSR from COVID?
From COVID, there is an awareness because we were faced with an unprecedented challenge. No one would have ever thought that in 21st century we would end up in house confinement, in a lockdown. The last time that humanity ended up in a lockdown was the 16th century during the bubonic plague, and then here we are in the 21st century, and we realize it was a shock, and this shock triggered an awareness about changing our lifestyles, our, brought social and governance issues. As a result, for example, a lot of ECG organizations deal more with the soft part, like the social and governance issues, health issues, access to health, access to education. So, and the impact on the environment about changing our lifestyles it triggered a massive wave of change. It's not evident yet, it's not there yet, but you can feel it builds on. Mm-hmm. We cannot remain the same. The shock is unprecedented. I mean, yes, we talk, as we said before, but you cannot do everything through the digital world, but the world out there has dire needs. Otherwise, we won't have, the clock is ticking. And then COVID showed us that the clock is ticking in a way that we had never thought it does.
Yeah, no, very good point. It certainly brought that home to us. Well, look, thank you very much, all three of you. Thank you to our audience for listening. David, we're bang on 4 o'clock, so we will stop there.
Yes, thank you very much. You did me proud. And thank you all for an incredible conversation. I thought there was so much in there to take away, and we covered a lot of ground in 90 minutes. So yeah, once again, thank you very much to Andrew for chairing the panel. And of course, to James, Celia and Pavlina for taking the time to speak to us today. It's very much appreciated. So as I said at the start of the session, this is the final session of the AMBA and BGA Festival of Excellence. I'd just like once again to thank all our speakers and chairs who have taken the time over the past couple of days to really sort of make this conference what it was, to make it as interactive, as engaging, and as challenging, I think, as what they could have done. It's been really incredible, and we've had so much wonderful feedback about it as well. Thank you all for listening. Thank you for your comments and your questions. I'd also like to take the opportunity to thank our headline sponsor, Blue Prism, and our event sponsors, Advent Group, Barco, and Studious Digital Education, for their support and their insight in helping us build this event. We couldn't do it without them. So thank you very much. I think that's all from me, but just thanks once again for joining the conference, everyone. And we'll look forward to seeing you, hopefully in May, on our next virtual conference, which is our global conference. And you can find out all about that on our website. So thanks once again, everyone, and goodbye.